Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the arrival of the official party and the playing of honors, and remain standing for Colonel Kirsten Kennedy's rendition of the national anthem, followed by Chaplain Mallard's delivery of the invocation.
Say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Good morning. I invite you to join me in prayer, please. Almighty Lord, sovereign God of all nations and peoples, we thank you for your steadfast love and care for us that has brought us to this day. Ever in war and peace, we in the profession of arms know of just how critical your sustaining power is in our lives. And because of your steadfast care for us, we can give you praise and thanksgiving for the common graces of this day, including this beautiful weather and the creation around us, but for the special graces of this day, including the class of 2024 and their families. We pray especially for them that as we celebrate their accomplishments this day, you would consecrate their efforts in scholarship and leader development and learning to the cause of peace, both here in our nation and around the world, both now and forevermore. Be present with us now, we pray, O God. All this we ask in your holy and matchless name. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. We would like to thank the Pennsylvania Army National Guard's 1st of the 108th Field Artillery for honoring our distinguished guest, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Honorable Kathleen Hicks, with a 19-cannon salute. We will begin today's ceremony with the recognition of the dedicated service of faculty who are retiring from the Army War College. Colonel Tim Book, Chaplain Colonel Timothy Mallard, Ms. Julie Manta, Colonel Dan Miller, Colonel Jesus Ramirez, Professor Doug Muddy Waters, and in absentia, Dr. Conrad Crane, also in absentia, Dr. Stephen Metz. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for our retiring faculty members.
We now turn to faculty awards. Our presenters are the Dean, Dr. Edward Kaplan, the Provost, Dr. David Dworak, the 53rd Commandant of the Army War College, Major General David Hill, our guest speaker, Honorable Kathleen Hicks, and the Army War College Command Sergeant Major Charles Gregory. Today, we recognize 8 faculty members who were selected by their peers for exemplifying the highest standards of teaching or innovation in education. Dr. Andrew Hill, Excellence in Teaching, Core Course Category. Captain Michael Hritz, Excellence in Teaching, Core Course Category. Dr. Mark Duckenfield, Innovation in Education. Colonel Trent Hunton, Innovation in Education. Commander Michael Posey, Innovation in Education. Dr. Charles Anderson, Innovation in Education. In absentia, Dr. Jonathan Kluge, Excellence in Teaching, Core Course Category. In absentia, Dr. Maurice Sipos, Innovation in Education. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for our faculty award recipients. At this time, we would also like to recognize Dr. Rory Cooper, who is seated in the front row of our distinguished visitor section. Prior to the ceremony this morning, Brigadier General McHugh, the A-Tag for Pennsylvania, presented Dr. Cooper an award to recognize his years of dedicated service as the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army for Western Pennsylvania. Dr. Cooper is retiring from his position after 10 years of faithful and dedicated service.
The Office of the Secretary of Defense Annual Research Challenge Award is presented to the following students for their integrated research project on protracted war. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Blackwell. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Carey. Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cuthbertson. Lieutenant Colonel John Erskine. Colonel George Flynn. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Guy. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Johnston. Mr. Michael Lionberger. Lieutenant Colonel Sean Parker. Colonel James Rowland. Lieutenant Colonel Wade Smith. This research challenge project was led by a group of 7 academic advisors consisting of Dr. Jared Harper, team lead, Professor Albert Lord, co-lead and advisor, Colonel Darren Buss, advisor, Colonel Carolyn Erickson, author, Dr. Buddy Frick, advisor, Dr. Kristen Mulready Stone, author and advisor, and Dr. Abram Trotsky, advisor. We will now present student awards for excellence in research, strategic thought, and communication on national security issues from the Army War College Resident Program and to Army War College Fellows. The Army War College Fellows Program consists of 79 officers who complete their senior level professional military education in a non-military setting at 44 locations in 52 programs across the United States and overseas. These programs range from the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies to Yale University. To present these awards, our official party is joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the Army War College Foundation, Colonel Retired Ruth Collins. Please hold your applause until all awards have been announced. The United States Army War College Commandant's Award for Distinction in Research is presented to Dr. Madeline Badeau. Her project advisor was Dr. Charles Pfaff. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Jameson, Fellow at the Secretary of Defense Corporate Fellows Program. His project advisor was Mr. James Markley. Lieutenant Colonel Calvin Knox. His project advisor was Dr. John Noggle. Colonel Jordan Schaub. His project advisor was Professor Lewis Youngert. In absentia, Colonel Ryan Agee, Fellow at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. His project advisor was Professor Albert Lord. And also in absentia, Colonel Finn Carey, a Fellow at Texas A&M University. His project advisor was Professor Bert Tussing.
The Army War College Foundation Award for Outstanding Research Project is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Chakudi. His project advisor was Dr. Charles Pfaff. Colonel Angel Jompert Monge. His project advisor was Dr. Sanel Garcia. Colonel Amy Neiman, Fellow at United States Department of Justice. Her project advisor was Mr. Philip Evans. In absentia, Colonel Stephen Flanagan, Fellow at Tufts University. His project advisor was Dr. Celestino Perez. In absentia, Lieutenant Colonel Claude Lambert, Fellow at Stanford University. His project advisors were Colonel Richard Butler and Dr. Carol Evans. The Army War College Foundation Colonel Don and Mrs. Ann Busey Memorial Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Michael Cookie. His project advisors were Dr. John Noggle and Colonel Chase Metcalf. Colonel Benjamin Iverson. His project advisors were Dr. John Noggle and Colonel Chase Metcalf. The Army War College Foundation Colonel Jerry D. Cashin Memorial Award is presented in absentia to Lieutenant Colonel Jason Wimberly, Fellow at Yale University. His project advisor was Dr. Robert Hamilton. The Army War College Major General Harold J. Green Memorial Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Shea. His project advisor was Dr. Sanel Garcia.
The Army War College Foundation Colonel Francis J. Kelly Memorial Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Schwengler, Fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University. His project advisor was Dr. Chris Mason. The Army War College Foundation Daniel M. Lewin Cyber Terrorism Memorial Award is presented to Mr. Andrew Welch. His project advisor was Professor Bert Tussing. The Army War College Foundation Dr. Sarah L. Morgan Memorial Award is presented in absentia to Lieutenant Colonel Ari Martin, Fellow at Tufts University. His project advisor was Colonel Jake Larkowicz. The AFCEA and Command Sergeant Major William and Mrs. Rosa Baranow Award is presented to Dr. Jerilyn Packer. Her project advisor was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Lushenko. The Association of the United States Army Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Anderson. His project advisor was Dr. John Noggle.
The Defense Logistics Agency and Lieutenant General Eugene J. D'Ambrosio Memorial Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Kyle Blair. His project advisor was Dr. Sanel Garcia. The United States Military History Institute and Army Heritage and Education Center Colonel and Mrs. Thomas F. Bristol Military History Award is presented to, in absentia, Colonel Adam Latham, Fellow at Harvard University. His project advisor was Professor Michael Rauha. The General Thomas Holcomb Strategic Writing Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Eldon Beck. His project advisor was Chaplain Colonel Timothy Mallard. The Military Officers Association of America Award is presented to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Rockeman. His project advisor is Dr. Ron Gurantz. Miss Samantha Schosberger. Her project advisor was Colonel Ian Murray. The Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association Award is presented to Colonel Thomas Petrini. His project advisor was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Lushenko.
The 454th Bombardment Group Award is presented to Colonel Randall Verde. His project advisor was Dr. Zanel Garcia. And finally, to honor exceptional leadership as the student class president, the Army War College Foundation presents a lifetime alumni membership to Colonel Damon De La Rosa. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for our Student Award recipients. Ladies and gentlemen, the Commandant of the Army War College, Major General David Hill.
Good morning on this glorious Central Pennsylvania day. This graduation day punctuates a year of hard work and accomplishment by our graduates, a year that really, really matters. Across the great professions within the United States, this might be the only one, or certainly one of a few, that invests a full year in the individual preparation of its experienced strategic leaders for what is to come. Perhaps that's a clear recognition of the compelling purpose behind service to nation here in our United States government, the Department of Defense, and across the 75 countries represented by our international fellows today. To the leaders on this field today, you have been thoroughly tested and have earned your new designation as a graduate of the United States Army War College. We are proud of you, and we're excited to see how you'll flourish in your future responsibilities. You leave here with our faith in you and our prayers for you. And now it is my honor to welcome the Honorable Kathleen Hicks, the 35th Deputy Secretary of Defense, as this year's distinguished guest speaker for the resident class of 2024 graduation. Deputy Secretary Hicks has a long public service career, giving her a unique perspective at the nexus of policy, strategy, and innovation. She held various civilian leadership positions at the Pentagon from 2009 to 2013, including Principal Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, before taking up her present post as the second highest ranking official in the Department of Defense. She oversaw the creation of the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review and the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, while serving the Secretary of Defense as the Secretary of Defense's advisor on important defense policy and strategy issues. As a Senior Vice President and Director of the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the leading national security think tanks in our country, Deputy Secretary Hicks has also left her mark outside of government. Deputy Secretary Hicks has a comprehensive understanding of the crucial role that cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence play in the age of strategic competition, and the Department of Defense's need to rapidly deliver a modernized AI-empowered military in order to win in competition and conflict. Deputy Secretary Hicks exemplifies the kind of cross-national cooperation that we at the Army War College strive to foster in our graduates, as well as the capacity to collaborate across government, business, academia, and the global community in order to maintain a competitive edge. Graduates, as you prepare to take on the mantle of strategic leadership in defense of our nations, I can think of no better example of principled, future-oriented public service than our distinguished guest today. Please join me in extending a very warm Army War College welcome to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Honorable Kathleen Hicks.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it is truly glorious weather out here. To Major General Hill and the Army War College faculty and staff who continue to provide leadership and scholarship here in Cumberland Valley. To the family, friends, and loved ones of the graduating class whose support has been vital to their success, not just this year, but for many years before. And of course, to the Army War College class of 2024, thank you all. Most especially for taking time to dress up on what would otherwise be a functional Friday. And I will begin with a promise: there will be no afternoon guest speakers today. I know your bags are packed, you're ready to go. If you don't have a car loaded up, chances are you're leaving on a jet plane. So I'll try to be brief. At a minimum, I guarantee I will not take as long as the history of the Peloponnesian War. Really, that's a low bar, I know. Really, I just want to tell one story. Many years ago, a lieutenant colonel came to the Army War College. Like many of you, he'd been serving for just over 20 years by that point. And he'd already had his share of deployments overseas. Now, history doesn't record if he partook in what are now time-honored Army War College traditions, like the Duck Derby, Jim Thorpe Sports Day, the Know Your World Expo, or the so-called Boatyard Wars. So we don't know if he ever dressed up like Colonel Carlisle Eagle, or if he had to cross a local pool using nothing but cardboard tape and determination. But we can presume that he took staff ride to Gettysburg, so he probably walked the terrain at Seminary Ridge just like you. And we can also be sure that after leading formations for so long, coming to the Army War College was a chance for him to catch his breath, to be able to pause, think, and reflect, to spend time and take care of his family and himself. And also a chance to debate candidly and learn alongside peers without judgment, to forge bonds with joint interagency, even international counterparts from ally and partner nations. We'll get back to that Lieutenant Colonel's story in a little bit, but for now, I'd like to focus on how over the last year you've gained from the Carlisle experience. Not just because you earned it or deserve it, but rather because you needed it to stay ready and for the challenges ahead. Think back to when your military or civilian national security career began. For those of you in uniform, the majority commissioned knowing that you would likely deploy to or in support of active war zones in Iraq or Afghanistan. Many, if not most of you, did deploy, clad in those desert camis and the digicam we all remember. It was the era of stop-move up armored Humvees and IBA vests, followed by the era of surges, MRAPs, and golden hour Cassavacs. Over 2 decades, a good number of you and your loved ones endured multiple deployments. Throughout, you made immeasurable sacrifices, as did your families. Of course, some of your teammates made the ultimate sacrifice. I know you carry their memories with you every day. And like every veteran of the 9/11 generation, many of you also bear the scars of those decades of conflict, wounds seen and unseen. For that, the nation owes you our deepest debt of gratitude. Yet despite all that, you chose to stay, to keep serving, to make service your career. So even if it does seem a little odd to graduate from a war college some 20 years after you first encountered war, this is part and parcel of your further development into the leadership ranks of U.S. and international security. And for your families and you, I also hope it's provided some respite. We owe that in gratitude to your families, your spouses, and your kids for their love and support, for their service and sacrifice. We have the fiercest fighting force in the world because we have the finest military families in the world. So let's take a moment to give all those loved ones here a round of applause. Having grown up in a military family, I know what it means to have a parent absent for holidays and birthdays, recitals and games. And so I know how special this year must have been, especially for those families who lived on post. To be able to have breakfast together, walk to the bus stop together, and to meet back at that bus stop after school. To be there for that run, jump, and hug. There is no other feeling like that in the world. I understand some of you were never able to do that until you came to Carlisle, and so to graduate today and go on to your next assignment must feel bittersweet. But we do need you, all of you, refreshed and ready to meet the daunting security environment facing us at this pivotal moment. We face a pacing challenge in the People's Republic of China, which is today the most consequential strategic competitor to the United States on the global stage, and it will be so for the foreseeable future. We face in Russia an acute threat to the international system, as illustrated by its ongoing cruel war of choice against Ukraine. We face persistent regional threats, like those emanating from North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. And while American service members are deployed today in those and other regions around the world, we also face threats that transcend national and regional borders, from pandemics to climate change. Here at Carlisle, you've studied most, if not all, of these challenges, from the new China Integrated course to the Polar Bears Club. And you've addressed them directly through your research papers and projects, many of which focus on real-world problems that the Army and DoD are grappling with today. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and I were fortunate to receive a brief recently from the representatives of the Army War College that looked at how to prepare, fight, and win in a protracted conflict. As we've seen in Ukraine, protraction is a condition we must prepare for. So we're applying relevant lessons to other theaters like the Indo-Pacific. It's just one example of how your scholarship here is informing real-world decisions on operations, activities, and investments. One trend I know you've observed from your studies is the rapidly changing character of warfare. Now, Clausewitz warned that it is ever-changing, but today, that change is fueled by the accelerating pace of technology. Even so, the value of land power endures, and that will not change. Just ask the 85,000 soldiers who've deployed to Europe to reinforce our allies and deter Russian aggression against NATO since Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Yet amid such a dynamic strategic environment, what land power is and what it can look like is changing, as it must. Just ask the Army multi-domain task forces and the Marine littoral regiments structured to operate spread across islands dotting half a hemisphere. Or ask the increasing number of long-range fires units that are a part of how we're reimagining our force posture to project power across domains, from land to sea, at distances beyond the horizon. Or ask the service members and civilians who are seizing opportunities to innovate every day, like using data and AI to improve our decision advantage, leveraging commercial technologies to deliver capabilities to the warfighter at greater speed and scale, and crafting novel operational concepts for how to use those capabilities in ways that confound our competitors and achieve our missions in the battle space. Every Army War College graduate knows what Elihu Root said over a century ago at this institution's founding, that the intent was not to promote war, but to preserve peace. That is still a bedrock truth today. We do not seek out wars. Instead, we seek to deter aggression against America, our allies and partners, and our interests. Because part of deterrence is being able to win if we're called to fight, that requires that we have a ready, capable, combat-credible joint force, a force that many of you will help lead and that others will support or operate alongside. But deterrence requires us to sharpen more than just the military tool of national power. Today's complex security challenges require whole-of-government solutions. In every region of the world, preserving and promoting peace demands that America also has a robust diplomatic corps, well-resourced development agencies, and a world-class intelligence community. Together, you comprise an enduring advantage that sets us apart and above our competitors and adversaries. We have many assets, of course, but the biggest one is our people and our allies and partners, you and those you will lead going forward. Make no mistake, you will be leading them into challenging times ahead, times that will try your skills and your souls. Over the course of your career, you've already been tested, and I say that notwithstanding the rigors of the past year. Thankfully, oral comps are behind you, but soon enough, you will be tested again and again and again. Some challenges will test your ability to respond under pressure or your ability to discern competing bits of critical information. Other challenges will test your commitment to lead, not just formations, but also the institutions in which you serve. Those of you in uniform have been taught how to lead troops since before you commissioned. Others have led teams at various times in your careers to date. That is still needed, with more empathy, creativity, and foresight than ever. But at the same time, we also need you to lead your branches, your services, your departments and agencies to ensure they keep pace with the changing world. And please know that being at the top of an organization isn't the only way to drive change. I understand I'm in a privileged position, but you don't have to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense to push for change. You can lead from anywhere in any organization. So from this point forward, take that as your charge. Be a change agent. As you shore up the institutional legacies you've inherited, shape and prepare them for what comes next. Because at times you'll face novel challenges, events and needs that we can't predict or even anticipate today, and you will be at the frontier of solving them. That's why what you've learned here matters. Taking time to pause and focus on theories, concepts, and first principles prepares you to meet these unknowns when they come, and they will come. Indeed, there may well be times when the basic principles and values that you've long held and upheld get put to the test. Our country is not immune from the authoritarian winds that sweep the globe. We have seen America tested routinely. While she has withstood, we cannot take that for granted. But you've had enough tests for now, so let me offer you 3 pieces of advice, a short study guide, if you will, to help you navigate the tests yet to come. First, remember your education and use it. What you've learned here matters and is meant to be applied. As leaders, we're counting on you to pay it forward. Share the knowledge you've gained and teach others by example. Second, rely on the teammates you've gained here at Carlisle and be reliable to them in turn. This year, you've met and learned from classmates and families from across the Joint Force, the U.S. government, and from all over the world. They've become your intellectual battle buddies, which means no future challenge need be yours alone to solve. When you face a wicked problem, don't be bashful about calling on a fellow graduate whose perspective might help unlock a solution. And don't forget to be there when one of them turns to you. Third, root yourself firmly in the values underpinning our democracy. Stay grounded in your commitment to healthy civil-military relations. Forge ties with those who have little direct knowledge of the military or public service. And live your oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Every day that you do, you strengthen the foundations of our professional, nonpartisan, all-volunteer force and career civil service. And by so doing, you demonstrate the strength of our free republic to the world. But you also show strength here at home. This year, several of you modeled how to build connectivity with your fellow Americans through the Eisenhower Series College program, traveling to reach over 2,800 people across 38 universities, high schools, and civic groups. We need more engagements like that because every citizen has a role to play in ensuring healthy civil-military relations. Like democracy itself, we all bear a responsibility in upholding and tending to it. Now, even if you follow all three pieces of this advice to the letter, I can't promise you'll pass every test you encounter. No one has all the answers. While you've learned here at Carlisle that the best answer might depend on many factors, there will be circumstances when you're the variable, and the success of the forces you lead and the nation you serve will depend on you. At the end of the day, all your education here can offer is a guide to steer you in the right direction. If anything, history tells us that human beings are perfectly imperfect at predicting what the future might hold. For instance, remember that lieutenant colonel whose story I began with? Well, after he graduated from the Army War College, he kept rising through the ranks. He led soldiers in peacetime and wartime, where he was awarded the Silver Star. He ultimately served 41 years in uniform and retired with honor and distinction. And that could have been the rest of his story. But unbeknownst to him, when he sat where you're sitting right now, history had other plans. Because today he continues to serve our nation as our Secretary of Defense. Now, where your paths will take you from here, no one knows for sure. After all, anything is possible, and the rest of your stories are still unwritten. But as you conclude one chapter of your service and begin another, I do know this. All of you will make vital contributions for the good of our country, our allies and partners, and the world. For that, both I and the nation are eternally grateful. So thank you very much, and congratulations.
Major General Hill, Dr. Dworak, and the Army War College are pleased to confer upon Honorable Kathleen Hicks the honorary degree of Master of Letters, Strategic Studies, honoris causa, together with all honors, rights, and privileges pertaining thereto, given at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, this 7th day of June, 2024.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, Class of 2024 diplomas are conferred under the authority of the United States Congress. In recognition of their accomplishments, the graduates will receive the diploma of the United States Army War College and, if earned, the degree of Master of Strategic Studies. Honoring our graduates today are Dr. Kaplan, Dr. Dworak, Major General Hill, Honorable Kathleen Hicks, and Command Sergeant Major Gregory. Please hold your applause until all diplomas and awards have been presented.
From Seminar 1, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew C. Johannes, Colonel Matt Amstel, Colonel Shane D. Day, Colonel Surgeon Glavanich, Lieutenant Colonel Melissa L. Hull, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey M. Kane, Lieutenant Colonel Edgar A. Lopez, Mr. Donnell C. McLean, Lieutenant Colonel Mohammed Muhammad, Colonel Alexis A. Peak, Lieutenant Colonel Luis F. Harrell, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph L. Slusser, Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Terrence L. Soul, Colonel Dilbikram Suba.
From Seminar 2, Colonel Aaron Joe Southard, Lieutenant Colonel Enos Harrich, Lieutenant Colonel Tyrone Jones, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel Emil J. Kesselring, Lieutenant Colonel Hardy Lamergas, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew B. McDonald, Lieutenant Colonel Jeff R. Milholland, Lieutenant Colonel Christian S. Newton, Lieutenant Colonel Michael A. Renato, Colonel Esteban Andres Ravaioli, Lieutenant Colonel John R. Roach, Brigadier General Wael Mahmoud Tabit Saidin, Lieutenant Colonel Bjorn E. Thorin, Lieutenant Colonel Lieutenant Colonel Joseph R. Winter.
From Seminar 3, Chaplain Colonel Michael T. Zell, Colonel Abdul Aziz Fahad Al-Dafiri, Lieutenant Colonel Teria L. Belgrave, Lieutenant Colonel Michael D. Cookie, Colonel John Edward Cooper, Mr. Kurt A. Gaynor, Colonel Babkin Garibian, Lieutenant Colonel Alicia Pamela Henry, Lieutenant Colonel Zachary R. Rolfe, Lieutenant Colonel Mark T. Schultz, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan P. Shea, Colonel Douglas S. Simmons, Colonel Michael P. Tumlin, Colonel Randall S. Vierdi, Colonel Kyle M. Walton.
From Seminar 4, Colonel Angela Renee Debal Lee, Brigadier General Ibrahim Saleh Al-Hor, Lieutenant Colonel Ivan L. Blackwell, Lieutenant Colonel Rosa V. de la Garza, Lieutenant Colonel Kiana N. Harder, Mr. Hugh Hiroshi Harden, Lieutenant Colonel Alfonso Ezekiel John, Colonel James O. Johnson, Mr. Marcus P. Jones, Colonel Sonyong Ko, Colonel Derek Dean Murray, Colonel Matthias Theobald Hans Rock, Colonel Teddy Tembo, Colonel Laura P. Wood.
From Seminar 5, Colonel Joshua A. Taylor, Commander Charles F. Bell, Colonel George Bogatsu, Colonel Yoav Bruner, Colonel Yassi Giovanni Chavez, Lieutenant Colonel Scott M. Davis, Colonel Mary J. Durham, Mr. Tyrus R. Edwards, Chaplain Colonel Jonathan G. Heitman, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony T. Howell, Colonel Jeremiah J. Hull, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah S. Kaiser, Colonel George Costas, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron E. Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Brian M. Vaden.
From Seminar 6, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah M. Ward, Ms. Kimberly D. Bunton, Colonel Rodrigo de Almeida Pain, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan M. Donald, Colonel Trevor J. Felter, Colonel Troy S. Johnson, Colonel Jeffrey J. Kornbluth, Colonel Patrick S. Mokosi, Lieutenant Colonel William B. Phillips II, Colonel Benjamin William Pitt, Lieutenant Colonel Denisas Stadikovicius, Colonel Kristen E. Steinbrecker, Colonel Chad D. Vermillion, Colonel Christopher M. Waddell, Lieutenant Colonel John D. Weissenborn, Lieutenant Colonel Brian L. Young.
From Seminar 7, Lieutenant Colonel Morris M. Sharber, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel Abdel Hakim Chaley, Colonel John A. Gabriel, Brigadier General Sanjay Gautam, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Gwynn, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher C. Johns, Colonel J.C. A. Park, Colonel Jaime Rengifo Abanto, Colonel Jeffrey H. Robertson, Mr. Michael J. Spiewak, Lieutenant Colonel Michael J. Stevens, Lieutenant Colonel Troy A. Wakaser, Lieutenant Colonel Lisbon J. Williams, Jr.
From Seminar 8, Colonel Virginia A. Knorr. In absentia, Lieutenant Colonel Eric J. Brenner. Colonel Casey W. Campbell. Colonel Michael C. Haith. Colonel John L. Harrell. Lieutenant Colonel Alan S. Jackman. Colonel Anthony J. Kaiser. Lieutenant Colonel Nancy R. Kibona. Commander Robert V. Liberato. Brigadier General Shaukat Osman. Colonel Matthew M. Schmunk. Mr. George Sfakianoudis. Colonel Mark A. Swan. Colonel Kamil Saltkoper.
From Seminar 9, Colonel Joshua L. Campbell, Lieutenant Colonel Seth A. Barron. In absentia, Lieutenant Colonel Russell C. Chance, Lieutenant Colonel William L. Chisholm, Lieutenant Colonel Michael S. Coombs, Lieutenant Colonel Yanak Deli, Ms. Patricia J. Durham, Colonel Robert K. Furtick, Lieutenant Colonel Ina S. Jackson, Lieutenant Colonel Eva Milari, Colonel Keith C. Mixon, Colonel Philip P. Murrell, Commander Travis W. Pantaleo, Colonel Salah Said, Colonel Douglas F. Seary, Colonel Lewis A. Spears.
From Seminar 10, Colonel Daniel Arntre Moser. Lieutenant Colonel Paulo Cesar Abdiano Rivera. Colonel Richard J. Bendeluski. Colonel Jesse A. Blanton. Colonel Michael K. Fleury. Lieutenant Colonel Katie N. Griffin. Lieutenant Colonel Jason R. Hansen. Captain Roderick L. Hodges. Colonel Angel M. Yompart Monje. Lieutenant Colonel Michael L. McRae. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick D. McGrail. Lieutenant Colonel Biljana Nikolavska. Colonel Bernard Baba Pantoa. Lieutenant Colonel Tina L. Ramirez. Mr. Charles T. Walker. Colonel Todd A. Wise.
From Seminar 11, Colonel Richard T. Karcher, Lieutenant Colonel Eldon W. Beck, Lieutenant Colonel Ricarlos M. Caldwell, Lieutenant Colonel Krista J. Gweller. In absentia, Lieutenant Colonel Christine M. Hines, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher A. Izquierdo, Colonel Robert F. Hordain, Colonel Teimuraz Kleteashvili, Ms. Jacqueline N. Leaker, Colonel Majud Mhala, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan D. Peruzik, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew W. Taylor, Colonel Robert Lorenz Tenharn.
From Seminar 12, Colonel Caitlin M. Perkins. Ms. Davida M. Beck Cameron. Lieutenant Colonel Christopher A. Brown. Lieutenant Colonel Christopher N. George. Colonel Seiji Ito. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin E. Jackman. Lieutenant Colonel Hamadou Karimu, Lieutenant Colonel Jessica J. McPherson, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph R. Mooks, Lieutenant Colonel John N. Nestor, Colonel Dizis Nestro, Lieutenant Colonel Philip S. Nowak, Lieutenant Colonel John M. Oliver, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew F. Quinn, Colonel Stephen R. Simmons.
From Seminar 13, Colonel Ann Kang, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph C. Bell, Lieutenant Colonel William W. Epley, Brigadier General Jihad Hakme, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Iannucci, Lieutenant Colonel Melissa E. Johnson, Brigadier General Nalaka Milsingha, Dr. Geraldine D. Harris Packer, in absentia, Lieutenant Colonel Jared Patton, Colonel Thomas V. Petrini, Colonel Ferenc Schlase, Lieutenant Colonel Danielle C. Taylor, Lieutenant Colonel Alex C. Tigner, Colonel Seamus Wilson.
From Seminar 14, Colonel Andrew J. Brown, Lieutenant Colonel Noel D. Chun, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph G. Dolce, Brigadier General Faridullah Hashim, Colonel Dietrich L. Ausby, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas P. Panapinto, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen M. Rockamim, Colonel Lucila P. Restrepo, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick L. Ryan, Colonel Roland Sobolik, Lieutenant Colonel Joshua J. Smith, Ms. Kimberly D. Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Charlene L. Thoreen, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob E. White, Lieutenant Colonel Nurgali Esenjulov.
From Seminar 15, Ms. Teresa A. Robinson, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Anderson, Colonel Powell Badnaj, Lieutenant Colonel Rob Brandstetter, Colonel Damon A. De La Rosa, Lieutenant Colonel Nicole L. Downs, Colonel Omar Lorenzo, Lieutenant Colonel John W. Moyer, Chaplain Colonel Masaki Nakazono, Colonel Talgat Salayev, Colonel Ganda C. Matupeng, Colonel Brian M. Travis, Colonel Tracy L. Yates.
From Seminar 16, Colonel Jeremy D. Guy, Colonel Khalifa Nasser Al-Omairi, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cuthbertson, Brigadier General Ajay Singh Dabas, Commander Connor R. Dar, Colonel Aaron H. Frazier, Colonel Andrew Hasparian, Colonel Kirsten H. Kennedy, Mr. Eric D. Mitchell, Colonel Robert M. Richardson, Colonel Jonathan M. Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Joshua M. Sturgill, Colonel Kyle Takamura, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Tisserand, Lieutenant Colonel Tyler J. Waterhouse.
From Seminar 17, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick M. Stevens, Colonel Ali T. Algetbedi, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph A. Andrzejak, Colonel Julia A. Brennan, Colonel Luke R. Clover, Lieutenant Colonel Adama Jah, Mr. Tom M. Jackson, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Cucci, Colonel Sean D. McMurchie, Lieutenant Colonel Michael N. Miller, Colonel Slamet Riadi, Lieutenant Colonel Jason C. Richards, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob E. Roper, Colonel James M. Rowland, Colonel Kyle R. Yates.
From Seminar 18, Colonel Benjamin F. Iverson, Colonel Andrew A. Baer, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas A. Cho, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Donhell, Colonel James R. Hewitt, Lieutenant Colonel Francisco J. Jofre, Colonel Stacy L. Moore Calloway, Mr. Joseph V. Orsi III, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly M. Reich, Captain Mr. Kaina Rakuta Mahefa, a mouthful, Colonel Gerald E. Rasmondo, Colonel Beth R. Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Wade G. Smith, Lieutenant Colonel Rasmus E. Solas, Colonel Jeffrey D. Soule, Colonel Jeremy W. Stewart.
From Seminar 19, Colonel Russell E. Henry, Lieutenant Colonel Kuang Yo Chang, Mr. James C. Chung, Colonel Shauna Jardin, Lieutenant Colonel Richard B. King, Lieutenant Colonel Robert M. Kinney, Lieutenant Colonel Stephen M. McNeil, Lieutenant Colonel Bernard K. Monroe, Lieutenant Colonel Charles C. Moss, Colonel Eric Oxenbogue, Colonel Scott Preisker, Brigadier General Wasim Raja, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Solar, Colonel Cornell Vaduva, Lieutenant Colonel David Charles Zessinger.
From Seminar 20, Colonel Karina L. Kelly, Lieutenant Colonel Mark A. Evans, Lieutenant Colonel Robert M. Hancock, Lieutenant Colonel Rosen Radkov Kantalif, Lieutenant Colonel Eric A. Keim, Colonel John Daniel Mitchell, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey R. Nordine, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine M. Ogletree, Colonel Khaldun Rashidat, Colonel Versicio Guzman San Jose, Jr., Ms. Samantha H. Schossberger, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Stone, Colonel Susan M. Tallman, Lieutenant Colonel Eric M. Williams.
From Seminar 21, Colonel Sean R. Shields, Lieutenant Colonel Kyle P. Baer, Lieutenant Colonel Marie E. Carmona, Commander Jairo Hidalgo, Lieutenant Colonel Yore Himaraja, Lieutenant Colonel James Andrew Nichols, Mr. Marco Nikituk, Lieutenant Colonel Kurt A. Pryor, Colonel Jordan D. Schaub, Lieutenant Colonel Christina L. Taylor, in absentia, Colonel Din Tamkai, Lieutenant Colonel Philip A. Trupiano, Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Van Dusen, Mr. Alfred Wong.
From Seminar 22, Colonel Ira D. Jones, Jr., Colonel Richard T. Chen, Mr. Brian K. Clevenger, Lieutenant Colonel Orlando N. Craig, Colonel Matthew J. Crow, Lieutenant Colonel John S. Erskine, Colonel Jessica D. Grassetti, Lieutenant Colonel Calvin A. Knox, Mr. Michael Wade Lionberger, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony L. Marston, Lieutenant Colonel Carla M. Martinez, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph A. Pascogin, Lieutenant Colonel Mr. John William Schleyer V. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan B. Williams. Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Ward IV.
From Seminar 23, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac L. Henderson. Dr. Madeline N. Badeau. Colonel Peter Lucas Braun. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen C. Chetcuti. Colonel Sapria Childs. Lieutenant Colonel Bernardo Gonzalez Lazaro Sueras. Mr. Michael T. Hackett. Lieutenant Colonel Angela L. Hughes. Ms. Pamela J. Lovash. Lieutenant Colonel Richmond R. Luce. Commander Michael S. Margolius. Lieutenant Colonel Elisha Parkhill Pippin. Lieutenant Colonel Carlos Ivan Penaguera. Colonel Derek K. Ping. Colonel Luigi Valentini. Colonel Michael D. Wise.
From Seminar 24, Colonel Michael R. Gary. Colonel Carl E. Bernander. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas W. Carey. Mr. Jason L. Flynn. Colonel George J. Flynn III. Commander Christian R. Foshi. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel F. Gebhardt. Colonel Bryce K. Kawaguchi. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Kuntz. Ms. Amber L. Mann. Lieutenant Colonel Hadia E. O'Neill. Colonel Ryan C. O'Reilly. Lieutenant Colonel Sean C. Parker. Lieutenant Colonel Philip S. Romberger. Colonel Delarius V. Tarleton.
From Seminar 25, Colonel Brian J. Cicluna. Colonel Marcus C. Antonini. Colonel Brian Banama. In absentia, Colonel Christopher E. Brawley. Lieutenant Colonel William Scott Douglas. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund A. Guy. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew R. Johnston. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick H. Kane. Lieutenant Colonel Grady D. Lowe. Lieutenant Colonel Saul Manzanet. Lieutenant Colonel William B. Simi. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel P. Snow. Mr. Andrew N. Welch.
Finally, the following 5 Army War College Fellows are in attendance to receive their certificate of completion. Chaplain Colonel Primitivo Davis, Fellow at Duke University. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Jameson, Fellow at Secretary of Defense Corporate Fellows Program. Lieutenant Colonel Tanesha Lindsay, Fellow at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Colonel Amy Neiman, Fellow at United States Department of Justice. And Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Schwengler, Fellow at the Reichman University International Institute for Counterterrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating the graduates of the United States Army War College, class of 2024.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and remain standing as Chaplain Mallard offers the benediction, followed by the singing of the service song medley and Auld Lang Syne. We invite you to sing along using the lyrics printed in your program.
Would you bow now and please receive this treasured benediction from Scripture? And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you May the Lord be gracious unto you and grant you peace, both now and forevermore. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing for the departure of the official party.